Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. I'm Barbara Larsson, Associate Governor on the FCC Board, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to the FCC today to meet Lucy Colback for her book launch on Afterbursts, Reliving World War II. And it's a pleasure to welcome you back to the FCC, former board governor, and to Hong Kong. You've been missed.
Thank you. I've missed Hong Kong too.
For the launch. Lucy comes from a globe-trotting family, lived all over the world. She was a banker, then journalist with the FT, Lex Column, and has now spent almost 8 years working on this book.
Yep, 8 years to come to fruition. That's quite a long gestation period, I would say.
She's traveled around the world, meeting survivors of the Second World War, all around the world, right? It wasn't just limited to Europe.
Correct. And both sides of the conflict, or indeed, as someone said to me the other day, all sides of the conflict, since we're now all on very different sides, still, again. So, World War II, the deadliest conflict in human history, spanned the globe, involved over 30 countries, and more than 80 million people died, not including those who were severely mentally and physically injured or traumatized. It's probably true that everyone in this room knows someone who fought in the war or who lived during that period, and emotions still run really raw about what happened. And 2025 is the 80-year commemoration of V-Day in Europe on May 8th and V-Day Japan on August 14th. So the book is really timely and very interesting to hear about it. Now, we were thinking about doing a presentation, then we thought about a conversation between us, and then questions and answers, questions from the audience. But I think let's do it as, and we've never tried this, let's do it as an open conversation. So I need your help that when I start with a question, if you have relevant questions, please ask for a mic and participate. Keep it to one question at a time, please. You can ask again second time. And keep it to the subject, because I've got 6 or 7, 8 questions that will go through some of the things that we'd like to cover. So if you can help me with that, I think it will be fun to do it as a general conversation. Sure.
Okay, so my first question, Afterbursts. I learned that it has several definitions. Did you know the meaning of the word before, and then that became the title, and you were thinking about it, or was it after you wrote the book?
I can see Tony grinning over there. Tony was present for the beginning, Tony Banham, who is our resident local historian, but he was present at the beginning in one of the early drafts. And originally it was called We Grew Old, because, after the World War I poem, they shall not grow old as we that are left that grow old. And so I thought quite appropriate, even though it's the wrong war. And that seemed a little bit morbid, potentially. So then I changed it to Shadows of War, which was a little bit, I guess, ho-hum. And right up until about 2 weeks before I was due to press go on publishing it, the word Afterburst just came to me, really. I was thinking, what words suggest kind of ripples, repercussions, and the resonance and the ongoing effect of something as monumental as the war, and Afterbursts just came to me as a word, which is, I mean, in hindsight, pretty amazing. It does, as you mentioned, have a lot of meanings. I've put them in the front of the book because occasionally people say to me, what does it have to do with postnatal depression? Because they don't understand what I'm saying if you think about the word and the way afterbirths, particularly in America. But it has, so it's the second, third ongoing burst of machine gun fire. It can also be the ongoing emotional resonance of, and it can be aftershocks. So it has a lot of different meanings, and I think all of them are really appropriate for the war. So I was very glad that somehow that word came to me.
Okay, because it's a lovely title.
Thank you. And in fact, it's the only use of it on the internet. So if you Google that, it's just me that comes up, which is even better.
And then, of course, the big question is, what made you decide to start on such a massive project that would involve traveling around and meeting all these people, maybe many of whom didn't particularly want to speak with you in the beginning.
Certainly, and I wonder if on the slides we could have is it possible to have them sort of moving behind us, and you'll see some of the people that I interviewed as we go along. I might let the technician people deal with that, but let me see if I can. No, I can't. I've got no control, so I'll leave that to them. So why did I write it? When I left finance, thank you. Oh, next page. Okay, I'll just sit here and click.
You want me to do it?
We sit here and click as we go along. Well, this is one of the first gentlemen that I met, actually, and that's the second gentleman that I met. So I was in banking, as Barbara mentioned, and I was a little bit, I suppose, disillusioned with banking. And at the time, the WWII adventure was happening. And I thought, gosh, you know, Chinese politics is an awful lot more interesting, actually, than banking. So I thought I'd go back to school and re-engage with Chinese, which was my undergraduate subject. And I was in Beijing studying and went down to Yunnan for a holiday. And when I was down there, I, you know, re-engaged with the history of the region and the fact that we had been allies in the war. And I thought, gosh, you know, we don't think about this or talk about this very often. And also at the time, there was the dispute between Japan and China over the Senkaku/Diaoyu Islands. And there were a lot of riots happening in mainland China. And young Chinese people were going into the streets and pulling Chinese people out of cars that were made in Japan and beating them up. It may have only been a one-off incident, but it hit the news. And there was a lot of unrest and a lot of unpleasant resurrection of wartime grievance. And all the people who were out there rioting were young people. And I thought, that really quite peculiar. You know, these young people, they've obviously received history about the war, but what do the people who fought that war feel about having their war experience resurrected in this manner and sort of lived through in this way, this kind of antipathy and antagonism between these two nations? So, particularly because China, Japan, and the US, at the time, still also to an extent, but that relationship was very critical for the global economy, and I thought, I'll go and ask them. That relationship, the way it was formed after the war, very much informs the way we relate now, nationally, those nations, and economically. So I'll go and ask, you know, how do you feel? Are you really glad? You know, are you happy to see the young Chinese out there getting a bit of revenge on your behalf? So I thought I'd just do China, the US, Japan, relevant. It's where I live. It's where we all are. And then I wrote a piece for the FT saying I was leaving to write, to interview World War II survivors and to write about their stories. And I got a whole load of letters from everywhere because I had forgotten to say I'm only interested in Japan and China and the US. And I got letters from everywhere. And at that point, I thought, I can't say, no, I'm not interested in your story, thanks very much, right? It doesn't fit my narrative, it doesn't fit what I'm looking at. So I just went, yeah, sure, I'll come visit you. So the first two gentlemen who were on the slides there, I visited in China. And then the next person that I went to see was a Holocaust survivor who had written to me from his home in Thailand. And he said, come and visit me, come and spend 5 days with me and my wife, and we'll take you to the death railway in Kanchanaburi. And so I started to educate myself, and I ended up going around the world. Once you this gentleman is British. Once you get into that community, if you like, once you tell people, once they find out that you're interested, oh, I've got an uncle, I've got, you know, my grandfather, my cousin, my whatever, my ex-wife's uncle's brother, you know, all these sorts of things. They all come out of the woodwork. So I just went, yeah, sure, I'll go traveling. You know, I'll just get my suitcase and take 3 months and make a plan.
How interesting.
It was fun. I mean, it was fascinating. It was more than fun. It was profound.
And did you find that some of these survivors were telling, how do they remember their history, because I think oral history changes, right? And sometimes we want to improve it, or our memory fades. I mean, I think sometimes I don't even remember what I did, 10 years ago exactly. How do you think, how true were they, do you think, to their memories?
I would say definitely they're true to their emotions. So, they might get the dates wrong. Maybe sometimes they weren't where they say they were. There is the trope of everybody says they were the first person to walk into Bergen-Belsen when it was liberated. And I did actually meet someone who was among the first people to walk into Bergen-Belsen when it was liberated. And when somebody said to me, this is a common trope, I was a bit horrified. I thought, oh gosh, here we go. I've kind of, I am falling for all these things. Somebody else told me they were on their cousin or something was on the last boat out of Shanghai. Oh yeah, everyone was on the last boat out of Shanghai. So I did actually go and I looked up this gentleman's history. He was with the 3 commandos, and I thought, well, were they even there? And the answer is they were there. So, it's entirely possible he was one of the people who went in, but whatever he remembered about it, even if it was received, he will have received it from his comrades, and he is maybe amalgamating their memories. So it's still valid. It may not be his own memory. I think we all have that experience. I've seen photos of myself as a child, and then I think I remember that particular incident, and of course I don't, because I don't have any memory. But the other thing I would say about it, firstly, they remember the emotion, and secondly, for a lot of them, they might not remember what they ate last week, but these were such deep experiences for them, and so, in many cases traumatic, that it's not something they struggle to remember. It's there like it was yesterday, and many of them said it is there like it was yesterday.
Wow. I have to confess that reading the book, I found the first 50, 60 pages quite difficult, because it was so many different voices, so many different ways of telling a story. They dropped words, they weren't complete thoughts. It was just a lot, it was a jumble of many things. And it just struck me as a lot of noise. And then reading your book further on, that's what a lot of the survivors talked about, was the noise in the war.
Yep.
Did you kind of do that?
It wasn't entirely deliberate. I'm glad that it seems like there was a bit of logic to it. It wasn't entirely deliberate. It was a style that I chose, though. I think in 2015, again, around about the time I was thinking of doing this, Svetlana Alexievich won the Nobel Prize for Literature, and the reason that she won, was because her works are, I think they called it a completely original sort of polyphonic oral history representation. And everything she does is verbatim. And I hadn't really seen anything quite like that before. And it's so immediate when you actually hear those voices. I guess for me, it's a bit of a cheat, because I do hear their voices, because I was with them, and because I've got hours and hours of their tapes, and it's almost, it's sort of in my mind constantly. But I felt it was really important to use their words. I don't think there's any way you can convey the immediacy of their experience without actually putting it the way they put it. Because to write, and then he said this, and he experienced that, and they experienced this, or she experienced that, it's sort of a bit removed. And if you stick with the first 50 pages of noise, then I think, I hope that you actually get to that point where you go, I remember
him. You then hear them talking to you. Yeah. And actually the way you had the stories kind of run together, there was no separation between some of the survivors, right? Their stories just went on.
That was deliberate, because once I ended up in this crazy mission creep world of, no survivor is too small for me to talk to, I felt very much that they should all be on the same pages together, whether they're Japanese or Chinese or German or American or Russian. They should all be side by side and given kind of equal place. I almost considered doing it blind, actually, so that you just heard. But then I thought that was almost a step too far. I think people like to know who they're reading about, so I didn't take it quite that far.
Okay. Well, I have to bring up, I suppose,
Yeah? Go for it. Microphone?
So why did these people want to speak to you? And to what extent had they, now I'm on 2 questions, sorry. to what extent do you think they had told everything to other people before?
So some had, most definitely. So for instance, in the UK, I came to most of my veterans through an organisation called the Taxi Charity, and the Taxi Charity takes veterans to commemorative events. So they all pile in a heap of black cabs and they go in convoy. So they had, mostly speaking, been to events and spoken at events, and they are known, I guess. Not all of them. Some of them, you know, they didn't want to speak necessarily. Others, you know, it was very hard finding Germans who would talk to me, as you can probably imagine. In fact, easier finding Japanese people who would talk to me. I think, why did they want to tell me their stories? Certainly in Japan, they wanted accounting. The hibakusha, the bomb survivors, they want an accounting of, they want an understanding, and they won the Nobel Prize last year. So they want an understanding of the horrors of nuclear weapons. And they are out there talking constantly about that. They're not necessarily talking about their own full experience end to end, but they are definitely, you know, activists against nuclear weapons. For the soldiers with whom I spoke, one of them had never told his story before my interpreter turned up just to check whether or not he had a story to tell. And I think it was a catharsis for him. And for many of them, it was a catharsis, right? They're coming to the end of their lives and they want someone to hear. And it's gratifying in a way that somebody cares enough to sit and spend the time with them and listen. And the other soldiers, they've spent time visiting China. They've spent time individually attempting to atone for what Japan did during the war. It's a massively contentious issue, particularly out in this part of the world. And you know, we can get into that. Japan hasn't made the same degree of institutionalized, it hasn't institutionalized its remorse in the same way that Germany has. And so it hasn't been reintegrated into its neighboring communities in the same way that Germany has. But the individuals, the Chukiren, who are the soldiers who came back from China into Japan, they were evangelizing about, you know, this is what we did. Everybody should know what we did, and they were shut up by the authorities. So there is a very strong individual desire from these people who experienced it that there should be some accounting and that there should be some knowledge and understanding of the war and of the things that Japan did, so that we can try and come towards some sort of reconciliation. So that's why they spoke to me.
Did you get any understanding from the Japanese soldiers or soldiers in general about how they got so dehumanized that they would be able to kill repeatedly civilians, babies, children, all of that? And I mean, this really touches home. My mother's family is from Nanjing. I just recently saw the new movie that came out about the Nanjing massacre. And it's really horrific. I mean, I knew the facts. I know the story from you know, family and grandmother. And even though my immediate family was not killed then, my mother's extended family was raped and killed. And the house was requisitioned and then burnt. So and I have Japanese friends. I mean, I've been to Japan. I worked for Morgan Stanley there. So I know the place, but there is that open sore. You just don't understand how people can do that.
So I think this is only a very small window onto it, but people are dehumanized in war, and otherwise they can't kill the enemy. So many of the Japanese with whom I spoke, and I think the Okinawans are kind of they're almost the most representative of how horrendous the education and the indoctrination was in Japan, because they had only recently been absorbed into Japan, and so they were being treated as third-class citizens, and they were forced to wear little placards if they were speaking Okinawan at home because they had to be speaking Japanese, and they were taught, and the younger generation took this completely on board. They were taught, you know, the emperor is a god, we will do anything for the emperor. And there was one woman with whom I spoke who was she was in a school where the girls were sent off to be nurses in the battlefield. And she did it with ardor and enthusiasm. You know, she thought she was fighting for a good cause. She had no idea, right? Young. It's like going on a pilgrimage, I don't know, going on a pilgrimage to somewhere as part of your religion. And she thinks she's doing something honorable and great, and they all took their school stuff with them, you know, their combs and their school books, because they thought they were going to be down there for a few days. And it was a horrendous experience. They were dealing with Japanese soldiers. They had, this was obviously, Okinawa was 44. Towards the end of the war, they haven't got supplies, they haven't got medicines. They are standing by tables where Japanese soldiers are having their limbs cut off with no anesthetic, and they're having to carry the limbs across the battlefield out there because they're expendable. So they're going out through the naval gunfire to drop off bits of body that have been cut off. And these Japanese soldiers are yelling at them. And can you imagine? You've gone in and you think you're doing something honourable and wonderful, and then this is what you experience. And even then, you're still thinking, well, I'm doing something for the fatherland. And then eventually you realise, shit, we were on the wrong side, right? Eventually you might realise that, eventually. So I'll tell you a bit about the brutalisation of the soldiers, though, and this is minor, very minor, but so this is from Yamada-san, who was the Japanese gentleman I mentioned earlier, who'd never told his story before until my interpreter turned up. And he tells about, I always started, you know, tell me about your childhood. How many siblings did you have? What did your parents do? Where did you live? All nationalities. So, you know, there's a mass of material that never made it into the work because it became a history of the war. But so Yamada-san talks about his family, and he says, there were 200 households in my village. During the summertime, we kept the house completely open, and fireflies would come in from the porch. We had mosquito nets, and the fireflies would rest on it. We would go to sleep while watching them. Looking back now, it was like a dream. We were poor, but very content. Right from my school education, I wanted to know how I could serve. When I was in 5th to 6th grade, the war was already taking place then. I thought it would be cool to become a military soldier, as did all the boys. First, there was a military soldier exam. You line up and take off all your clothes except your underwear. I passed with a top score. I entered the military troop in Kurume. It was hell. I wanted to run away. They slapped me every day with a slipper, and it affected my jaw. I cried in the bathroom. Being slapped for no reason, it was miserable. Because it was so painful, I wanted to go to the battlefield as early as possible. So his experience is like, it's so awful with his people, it's so awful in his training, the battlefield is a relief. How horrendous is that? He then spent 3 weeks, I think, in the hold of his ship, genuflect. They were allowed up on deck 3 or 4 times a day to relieve themselves and maybe get fed. But they were genuflect. All the way there, it was so horrendous that some of the soldiers threw themselves off the side of the ship, and the ones who made it were so their muscles were so wasted that they had to be rehabilitated when they got to Singapore. So they had to be rehabilitated before they could send them to the battlefield because the guys couldn't even walk. So they were not good to their own people. If you go to the Yushikan Museum, actually, it's quite interesting. I found that quite informative in a slightly horrendous fashion. But let me point out that I believe all nations' histories are not that dissimilar, right? When they were tribal, they would go to the neighboring village, and they would burn down the neighboring village, they would kill all the men, and they would take all the women home. And they would take them as whatever, you know, wives, sex slaves, whatever you want to call it. They did that to the neighboring village. And that hadn't been that long before. We like to think we're civilized because when we were doing that, it was centuries ago, but we did it too. Question?
Yeah, was there a difference in exactly that sort of framing around the Japanese experience to, say, the British or the Germans? I mean, everything you said about the Japanese there sounds to me like a First World War British soldier. I don't think the soldiers in the second, my great-uncles who threw themselves on the machine guns and all that stuff, they were dulce decorum est. But in 1939 in Britain, I don't think that was the point. But so the imperial, we do this just because of the king, I feel like that was different. Was that a misconception on my part, or was it actually did you sense a different motivation?
That's a really good question. I'm thinking through that one. I mean, I never got the sense. So they did it because the Americans and the Brits, they could see that there was bullying happening in Europe. That was the motivation that most of them gave me, was we could see that there was bullying happening. After Pearl Harbor, obviously, you know, the Americans were all in. Up until that point, they were a bit indifferent. But when Pearl Harbor happened, there's a bit of testimony from a few people who remember where they were when Pearl Harbor happened. And then they're all like, sign me up, let me get in, quick. I want to get in now, even though I'm 16, because the war might be over before I get there, and I want to have a go. So there was vengeance for Pearl Harbor, for the Americans. For the Brits, the ones with whom I spoke, I mean, one of them said, I didn't want to go. I had a really nice life. I was in the countryside. I was running around looking at birds and, you know, walking my dog and having a nice time looking at the forests. I didn't want to go, but I was signed up, and I was the first man to be signed up in Kent. And then there were others who said, I saw that there was horrendous bullying going on in Europe, and we didn't feel that that was right. And there were the black shirts in the UK, and they didn't feel that was right. So they wanted to get involved so that they could be on the right side of history, I guess. So it was quite different. John.
Hello, my name is John Ball. Just if I may introduce a couple of things to you. I was 6 years, 10 months old when the war broke out. I was in the bosom of my father's mother, cuddling up to me, and I remember her saying, oh, those Zeppelins, there's Zeppelins, and those Zeppelins are coming again. Shock. Dear Grandma from World War I. The other story is my other grandma, when she was living in Edgware Road, Marylebone, and one night during, of course, by that time it was the Blitzkrieg, the Nazi invention of air bombing, and her home got a direct hit. It was a pile of rubble. Luckily, she was in the Anderson shelter in the garden. And my mother and father, my father was something special at Scotland Yard during the war. And anyway, he got a car, we got there, and there was dear Grandma, Kenzie, coming. She's only 5'2", little round barrel, 2 handbags, a face as black as soot, and she came over the top and she was saying, well, they didn't get me that time, did they? And those are the couple of stories I wanted to share with you. There are others that we'll talk about later, but that's how it was during the war, from my point of view.
Thank you, John.
Very much for letting me interfere with you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And not just, I think, dehumanizing the soldiers, but the way the soldiers manifested that, whether it was the Jews in the Holocaust were subhuman, or the Japanese called the Chinese pigs. They were, you know, they were just subhuman.
Yeah, and it's what education needs to do during the war to motivate people to go out and kill someone else. You also hear, you know, the oft-quoted story, I'm sure it happened to more than one soldier, of I came up over the hill and I saw this young man on the other side and we looked straight into each other's eyes, and then we turned around and went back down the hill in opposite directions. Because, you know, you're actually looking at someone, and I'm sure in the heat of battle, it's like bang, 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 a load of bullets. You know, quite a few of them said to me, I chose artillery because I wouldn't have to see who I was killing. You know, I chose something far back where I was doing defense so that I didn't have to see. I chose to be a medic so that I could save lives instead of kill people, rather than actually having to look someone in the eyes and stab them. I mean, in Pine Mountain, again, I mean, just to speak to the brutality, but it happened also in Impal. In Pine Mountain, they had 62 sets of individuals, Japanese and Chinese, locked together in death grip, hand-to-hand combat when they cleared that battle site afterwards. 62 pairs of people who had killed each other with their bare hands, and they were there, locked together. You have to be inhuman. And in fact, even clearing up the, let me see if I've got what Harasan said here. So this is a testimony from somebody who was in Hiroshima after the bomb dropped. He was in training, he was 18, he was one of the emergency conscripts very much towards the end of the war, and they were training basically for the mainland invasion. They weren't actually given any weapons. They didn't have any, I don't think, left many at that point, certainly not for the home front. So they had a grenade. I think most often they might have carried 2 grenades. The schoolgirls I mentioned earlier, they weren't given any grenades, so they would beg the Japanese soldiers for their extra grenade, because like, how are we going to kill ourselves if the American demons come? When the American demons come, how are we going to kill ourselves? Please, can you give me your grenade? So Hara-san was clearing the bodies, and even he was dehumanized by that. And he says, on the 4th day, I went into the city for the first time. We had to build roads, and there were corpses all over the place which had to be disposed of. We had to become machines in order to do our jobs, like human robots. If we had maintained our humanity, we wouldn't have been able to work. We could not have any feeling of pity. Tim.
You mentioned at the start that one of the inspirations was these young people burning Japanese cars and everything. So when you talk to these veterans, did they ever mention about young people today, and was it worth it?
Well, I didn't ask them that specific question. I did ask them about young people today, actually. I said, how do you feel about where the world is now? It's almost, for when you get into that mindset of speaking to people who went through all this stuff in their youth, and then even I can't get my head around the difference between what the world was like when they were young and now. I mean, I can't even get my head around what the world was like before email and now, and I was around before email. So when you talk to them about that, I mean, none of them ever said it wasn't worth it. Quite a few of them did say, I'm sitting in the car and my grandchildren are in the back all talking to each other on their text message, you know, like, why can't we have a conversation? Why won't they sit at the table and talk to each other? So there was, I think there is an element of, there was potentially a little bit of disappointment that there's less communing between them and their grandchildren than they might have liked. I don't think that's necessarily uncommon, though. That's probably not only common to their generation either, but maybe we've become more distant across generations now, and technology has done that a bit. You know, some of them said technology, you know, from the communication perspective, not a great thing, but from the medical advances and, you know, all those fantastic things, a wonderful thing. And then also from the communication perspective, also a good thing, because in translation and the ability to speak to people who are a long way away, and maybe the ability to sort of cross borders that we couldn't do before. A number of them said, learn a language. Speak to the other person. I think it was Anita Lasker-Wallfish who said, go and have a coffee with the enemy first, right? Learn about them as a person. See who they are. Maybe you can resolve your differences. Maybe you have a whole bunch of preconceived notions about them that aren't true. Have a conversation before you get into that point. Of course, unfortunately, we don't get the chance to have the conversation. It's always our leaders, and they're always telling us what they want us to hear. But to go back to your earlier question about, your actual question about the grandchildren, we had conversations around the topic of, I'm not very close to my grandchildren. I think technology might have been a factor. And we had conversations also around the topic of, I would not like my grandchildren or great-grandchildren to go through what I went through. Full stop. Never mind whether I'm glad I did it for them, I would never like them to have to experience what I experienced.
Richard?
History is generally written by the victors. In your 8 years of research and discussions, did you come across any events or themes which are not generally known?
I disagree, personally, actually. That's what I found in the 8 years of my discussions and travels. I think history is written by the land on which you're standing. And so there's a slide, watch out for it, it will come round at some point. On one side, there's a submarine, and on the other side, there's a red placard. And the submarine is the Bowfin in Pearl Harbor. And the placard is in the Tsushima Maru Museum in Okinawa. And the Bowfin in Pearl Harbor is, an example of a submarine that served during the war. It's quite pokey. Apparently, they were all quite pokey in those days. And but it's quite nicely appointed. And they have all the specs, and they say all the missions, all the expeditions or explorations and outings that it went on. And then in the Tsushima Maru Museum, at the time that I went, there was nothing in English except for one section, which was the description of the submarine that had sunk the Tsushima Maru. And the Tsushima Maru was a ship that was an evacuation ship from Okinawa. It had 800 and something souls on board, of which 700 were children. So they were evacuating school children. And the Bowfin was the submarine that shot that torpedo that sunk that ship full of school children. And it's shown in the Tsushima Maru Museum, that one there, yep. But there's no record of it at the Bowfin. So on the right, you have victims. On the left, you have people who were doing their duty. And didn't they do a great job? And didn't we do fabulously because we won? Those sailors, I think, I can't remember how many years it was before they were told. In fact, they made 30-something. There were an awful lot of things that weren't revealed during the war for the sake of morale. I don't know if any of you have seen, I think it's Rogue Heroes, the SAS show that's been on recently, and there's a scene in there where they're going ashore somewhere in North Africa, and they pass drowning British sailors that they can't take on board. And that happened. I don't know about that specific incident, but I did speak to a sailor who was on the Arctic convoys, and often they were told, you can't pick anybody up. Now, he was actually on a boat where they did pick people up. And I'm not saying he was so great because they disobeyed orders. It depended on the circumstances. Sometimes you were told not to pick survivors up, and sometimes it was all hands to the nets to drag them on. Didn't matter what nationality they were. And I think the sailors were probably, on the whole, better about that than the guys on land. Yes, Jen.
Just following up on Tim and Richard's questions. Last week, as you know, China held a huge military parade commemorating the 80th anniversary. It very much emphasized Japanese atrocities and raised a lot of issues diplomatically with Japan and Taiwan. And then, of course, we had the leaders of China and Russia standing there presenting themselves as the new defenders of the post-war international order. So two things, really. One, I just wanted to ask your thoughts on how the war is commemorated in different ways. And yeah, to the question about history, sort of how some parties might be trying to change the narrative and the way it's talked about. But also, there have been a lot of comments in recent years from people saying, there's so many parallels between what's happening in the world now and what's happening in the 1930s. And the people that you spoke to, did they express any concern that we might be going down a similar path?
Yeah, absolutely. So when I started, not only did we have the riots, upheaval in China, we also were sort of cantering slowly towards Brexit. And a lot of the, Blitz spirit, hey, let's all stay together and keep out the foreigners. A lot of Blitz spirit was invoked, a lot of wartime kind of emotion, if you like. And then on the other side of that, you had quite a few of the veterans writing in and saying, please don't throw away the peace for which my comrades died. We are united, and there's a reason for that. You can argue about the economic aspects till the cows come home, but they felt very much, not all of them, some of them were pro-Brexit, but those who were writing about unity were very scared about the atmosphere. And I mentioned Anita Lasker-Wallfish earlier. I saw a testimonial that she actually spoke in front of the Bundestag. I can't remember exactly what year it was. It might have been the 70th anniversary of the end of the war. But she was saying, it's getting hairy. And I asked all of them, how do you feel about this now? And I was interviewing between 2016 and 2020, before COVID broke out, basically. Funnily enough, the only person who raised Russia was the Chinese guy I first met. He said, what's going on in Ukraine? 2016 that was. But there were quite a few who expressed great concern, because I asked that question, you know, do you feel that we are in a similar sort of place atmospherically? And they said, absolutely, very, very concerned about the direction in which we are going. So that answers one of your questions, but there was another aspect to it.
The parade
Oh, yeah. The way history is commemorated. Well, I mean, to answer that, I'll give you one little factoid, which is that when Mao met with Japanese officials after they had won the Civil War, the Communist Party had won the Civil War, he thanked the Japanese and said, you know, appreciate your efforts on our behalf of annihilating the nationalist soldiers. Appreciate the fact that you weakened them so much that we won the Civil War. No hard feelings, no reparations necessary. And 70 years on, all of a sudden, it's like, and maybe, you know, you could argue he was misguided, but history is totally manipulated depending on the political sentiment requirements of the time. You know, let's find a bogeyman over there so we don't have a look and see what's going on internally. Let's all distract because we can unite against an external force. Right? We can all be united against something that's happening over there, even if we can't agree on what's happening in here. And I kind of sometimes think, what's it going to take for humanity to unite? Is it going to be aliens? Because I bet we're all up there against the aliens together, suddenly. Guy?
Just turning sort of a follow-up question on the Russia angle. Did people express views about the war in Ukraine at the moment, and having lived through what they've lived through, what they're now seeing today? I mean, propaganda and manipulation possibly associated with that. Was anyone able to talk about that?
There's a lot of different stories. I could take that particular question down. So I stopped interviewing before the war broke out. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that, you know, when I said, who do you think the biggest risk is, all the Americans said Russia. One or two, well, not all. One or two said North Korea. You know, it was very much, I guess, still that sort of reds under the bed kind of mindset. But those all said Russia. A Russian philosopher with whom I spoke said, why are you guys always bagging on Russia, right? Can't we be nice? Can't we make nice? Can't we be friends? But then my interpreter, who was born in '65 and said his experience was kind of, you know, born into Soviet security, had a good education, went into the military. He was massively anti-America, massively anti-Gorbachev and the fall of the Soviet Union, and not always 100% accurate with translating either side of the conversation that I was having. Because he was filtering the conversation that I was trying to have. And one event in particular where the first Russian veteran that I met, actually, whose story didn't make it into the book, but I would always ask, not only how do you feel about the world today, you know, how do you feel about your grandchildren fighting? Do you think any of us who weren't there can actually understand? Answer, generally speaking, not really. But I would also say, how do you feel about the enemy now? It wasn't universally positive. I did get some people who well, there was one gentleman in particular who said, you know, if a Japanese man walked into the room now, I'd shoot him from the feet up and I wouldn't stop. He never saw combat, which I thought was quite interesting. He liked to beat up his own comrades. So I think that gives you a bit of an idea about his mindset. But almost everybody else said, can't say I'd want to buy a Japanese car or a German car, can't say I love them, but I do get we're beyond that. You know, we've moved on. But when I asked Boris, how do you feel about, you know, the enemy? He said, he gave me quite a long story, but the essence was, you know, our children were not born for war, right? I don't want us to fight. We should make peace. And I said, oh, that's great, because all the Americans say the same. You know, the Western soldiers with whom I've spoken, and in fact, I'd just come from Germany, and one of the German veterans I spoke to said, I hope you find some Russians who don't still, you know, feel horrendous about us. I do understand, you know, it wasn't pretty. And Boris said, no, you know, no hard feelings. I think our children should live in peace.
Did you find the Russians, or did they find you?
I found them, long story, I'll come back to that one, but I just want to say what Boris said, because what happened was the translator said to him, nobody else thinks that way.
Oh, wow.
And then Boris, to his credit, wasn't crushed. I mean, he was a little bit crushed, but he didn't stop. He then said, you should understand that constantly saying that the only thing America does is harm, it won't make things better. Find common ground. Some people really dislike Englishmen, my friends, for instance, and having been there in England, it seemed to me that people are the same there. And they want to be friends with us. The country went through such a hard war and it hasn't recovered yet. And I said something about, are you worried that we might have another war? And he said, yes. It depends on what kind of propaganda will be out there and what we will instill in young people.
Quite chilling. Yeah. Alexandra?
Thank you. So you mentioned non-combat individuals, and that's what I wanted to ask. If you go to the Commonwealth War cemeteries in Singapore or here, it's incredibly poignant because there are so many people who were cooks or stewards or stokers on the ships or in logistics of various sorts.
Yeah.
And my granddad was a quartermaster sergeant, and he, I think, had what they call a good war. He travelled all over the world and he did not see combat. So I wondered whether you met some of those people and how their experiences differ from the real frontline troops.
I did meet some of those people. And yes, there were some people. I didn't meet as many who found it an adventure, I have to say. I mean, it was an adventure for some. In fact, one person whose story I received, but it was secondhand, so I didn't end up using it. But it was fascinating. His grandfather was Burmese, and he was with the SOE. And he spent his entire war on adventures trying to find intelligence, it seemed like, and never quite finding what he was looking for, but being parachuted into places and, getting rescued from places in ribs. And his own memoir of that period is called The Best Years of My Life. So there were people who had a great adventure. There were people who saw the world who would otherwise not have seen the world. And there were people who went straight back to doing what they were doing before the war and went, thank God that's over. And then there was the emancipation of women. Without the war, you wouldn't have had women in factories, and you wouldn't have had women coming out of the war going, hang on a sec, I'm not giving up my drill. So
I think we have time for one more question.
Lucy, I just wanted to ask a question. Did you notice a difference between the volunteers and the conscripted people that you were interviewing? I mean, you look at things in the war like submariners and perhaps the Polish Air Force as part of the British Air Force, and you see behaviour of a certain type, which may be engendered by the fact that they're going to war. I just wondered if you differentiated between people who actually volunteered for a lot of these experiences.
I don't think they did, really. I mean, there were a few. The gentleman I mentioned earlier who was, out in the forest with his dog, bird watching and having a lovely life. He was a bit miffed that he was conscripted. But on the whole, I think because it happened to the whole generation came back from war, and that's also one of the reasons maybe that PTSD obviously wasn't dealt with, recognized, because everyone went, well, everyone else has had the same experience. What's special about me? Let's just get on with it. Let's get married. Let's have kids. Let's kind of put it behind us as much as we possibly can. And if they woke in the middle of the night screaming, which many of them did, their wife would say, you woke in the middle of the night screaming again. There were conscientious objectors, not many. There were people who maybe directed their futures a little bit more by choosing different parts of the services or the forces in which to serve. But I think because it was universal, no one went, well, poor me, I was conscripted rather than drafted, and I was totally up for it, because I enlisted. So not so much, because as I say, it was across the entire generation.
Well, thank you very much for attending. Thank you for speaking. And I'd like to just tell everyone that the FCC is open to new members, and you don't have to be a journalist to become a member. We have great events, lunches, evenings. We're having opera, a lot of live music. We do a lot of great and different events. We've got a jazz club downstairs. So yeah, do join us. And we have the best bar in Central. And a present for our speaker.
Oh, thank you.
Of the
Thank
FCC.
you very much.
Thank you very much.